talked a lot about barriers, and I personally come from a background in swapping out light bulbs for a living as a young guy, and everything, and saw that sort of firsthand. That to me seemed like a combination of some markets and incentives, then policies came in sort of banning the bulb and a range of things. Does it take a kind of a multi-pronged approach in order to get people to pick up those $20 bills off the ground? How do you unlock this?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of our work is studying exactly that, and indeed some of you will be familiar with our highly colourful analysis of barriers, and which involves a range of primary and secondary barriers. And the policy tools that you need to apply to overcome them, they have to be implemented in an integrated way. So if you say that there are three major tools, there's regulatory instruments, economic instruments, and communicative or educational instruments. If you rely on only one of those, then you'll come unstuck in terms of implementing programs, whether that's government programs or other agencies. Because if you just do regulatory, then of course you'll get backlash. If you just do economic instruments, then you'll go broke. And if you just do education, you'll probably get up to 5% max take-up. So you need to actually do all three of those, and then there are a whole lot of secondary instruments that we talk about. So that combination, it's actually much more complex than just saying, oh, let's go out and have a program. And so we've been, of course, counselling and designing programs for some time, and recognise that importance of integration. And
do you think it's some of that complexity, despite the compelling economics, it's put up some really big numbers up there in terms of the value to the economy of improving energy productivity? Is it, despite the compelling economics, it's just the underlying complexity of all those requirements in order to kind of get this unstuck?
Yeah, I mean, one of the issues is that by definition, demand-side activities, customer-based activities have a huge number of different stakeholders and a huge number of different industries. In some ways, I mean, it's been difficult enough in renewables, obviously, with cheap, low cost of fossil fuels, with institutional and political interference, and so on. But with energy efficiency, in addition to that, you've got this complexity of the market and the transaction costs, which make it really difficult to finance it. And it's hard for people to cut a ribbon on it. That's one of the issues. But we're making huge progress, and I think the redefinition to energy productivity to say it's not just about the energy saving, it's actually also about the improvement in value which you get from energy productivity is part of that equation.
Yeah, great. We'll go to the phones, as they say. Stuart, how can Australians take a leadership position in improving energy productivity? Will it require efforts from everyone, industry, politicians and everyday people?
Yeah, well, I guess this is part of the logic and intent behind the Doubling Energy Productivity program, which, as many of you know, because you're part of many of the people in the audience are part of our different working groups, there's at least 150 people and often organisations they represent who are involved with that. So it's a huge, long march, if you will. It's a stakeholder intensive, and we've had enormous support from the different groups. It sort of brings together a lot of groups that wouldn't normally work together, and indeed the government, so there's been strong support from government as well. It's disaggregated, but it's absolutely crucial that it lifts to the level of improved communications, and that's one of the things that the Australian Alliance for Energy Productivity is now looking at, is saying how do we, with other stakeholders, work on the communications piece, because what it hasn't done is get to a broader audience. I mean, I think everyone here will be familiar with it, but the broader audience don't really get it.
Maybe moving away just momentarily from the sort of communications and policy side of things, just this question here, which I like, is what is the most innovative solution you've seen for energy productivity and why?
Well, I sort of tempted one that is always a bit of a favourite of mine, but it never does very well in the workshops that we run, is some work that a colleague of mine, Elizabeth Shove, has been doing in Japan, looking at changing the dress code for businesses in Japan, which is quite a challenge. So they say, Amory Lovins used to always say that a tie is worth $47 worth of installed capacity. So I could just rip it off.
Exactly.
And,
that's why I've come without a tie.
Exactly.
Got in trouble earlier, but it's worth it.
But I mean, so leaving it aside, I mean, I think we've probably not looked as carefully as we should at some of the cultural and social aspects of energy use. So I think there's a huge amount to go there. But one of the things that is emerging, and we've seen this through O-Power, Green Button, and different initiatives like that, is unlocking the power of digital services and social media for people to have more control over their bill. We're already seeing, like, Google has bought Nest, Apple has HomeKit, Samsung have an equivalent. Will the next energy utilities be the big tech companies? Because they've seen where this is going. They've seen that the ability to relate to many different disaggregated demands through social media, through control, home control and so on, is extremely important and worth a lot.
Yes.
So I think that's probably the biggest disruption that we'll see in the next 5 years.
Yeah, great. The sort of related that you talked a little bit about some of these large, big internet giants there putting a toe in the water in the energy sector. How important is real-time data and verification for ongoing energy productivity? So whether that's data that consumers get to see, so they actually understand more, or I guess data out on the networks, or take that as you will.
It's going to be absolutely crucial.
Yep.
As I said, the opportunities that are provided, and for those who are familiar with, less familiar with Green Button, it's voluntary, but it is a strong engagement with utilities to provide data back to their customers. So I think we need something like that soon.
Yep.
And there's been some fantastic work about providing data about the energy system, and that's going to be absolutely important to implement the results of the Chief Scientist report, of course, on the system level, but for that consumer level, that's the next step. Then you take it to the next level, which is the application, for example, of the Internet of Things to, for example, the cold chain, so that we can monitor, people can understand the temperature of cold chain continuity through the Internet of Things. And so we're talking, again, in the period of sort of 3 to 5 years, there'll be big transformations there. So that's another level of data, but it's absolutely crucial, and we've already seen that with building management systems and so on in certain sectors.
Yeah, great. It is fascinating to think about the intersection of data, energy, so food and ag value streams, and all the sensing that goes with that being somehow bundled together. It takes it very much away from the way we think about it as sort of quite compartmentalised.
Very different to the traditional energy industry, which is power stations, power lines, customer.
Yes, absolutely. It's fantastic. How do you make energy productivity as sexy as a solar farm or a big Tesla battery? And it goes to your point around sort of the ribbon cutting or building community engagement and excitement. How do you do that? Yeah,
that's probably one of the most difficult questions that we face. But that's exactly one that A2EP and a few of the other key industry stakeholders have been looking at, is to say, how do we improve the understanding within the community around this? And I mean, it's hard for me to answer that because I've always found it sexy. So I guess an energy-saving nerd. But I think this energy productivity is one way, of course, of appealing to at least business sector to understand that there's actually value here, and that people it's really focusing the mind, the increase in electricity price and the increase in gas price, and of course that will drive some of this. But I do think we need a mass communication campaign about this, and there have been some of these run in Europe by one of the major hardware suppliers who sells insulation, actually ran a TV mass campaign around go to your local hardware store, buy some insulation and other products that they sell that will save energy. And it was extraordinarily successful. I mean, that's why companies advertise. So I think there are some opportunities for that good old-fashioned, let's talk about saving energy again.
Yeah, interesting. And that might go hand in hand with, and one of the other questions out there was around sort of responses to energy prices. Do you think that may trigger a sort of a natural response in end customers? And probably a double-barrel question there. What then does that mean for more vulnerable consumers who don't have the capital, maybe the understanding of the time to implement these sort of savings? So you've got higher prices, creates this opportunity, potentially for response, but what about those who might be more vulnerable in the community? Yeah,
we're already starting to see an impact from higher prices, and certainly we're starting to see it in terms of equity and social impact, and this is absolutely a role for government, and in a sense it's a win-win to be able to provide that kind of support at the same time as putting in place measures which reduce energy use and save energy and provide more agency for customers.
Yep.
So they're absolutely crucial, and that'll for both purposes. So we need more of that.
Yeah, great. So again, another win-win of sort of
Yeah.
energy efficiency, energy productivity. It's great. In our last minute, I quite like this one. You talked about energy productivity as the fifth fuel. If it takes off, is it a threat to the renewable sector? Should we be seeing you guys as a competitor or something that complements the work that the generation side of the ledger, if you like, should be looking for?
It's interesting. I mean, there are only a few instances. I mean, we've seen examples where in systems for cogeneration or trigeneration, where you might have a large capacity system which then produces excess energy. So then there's a need to have more and less efficient swimming pools to use up the waste heat and so on.
Yep.
But there are actually very few. Most of what we've looked at in this context, there's a powerful synergy between renewables and increasingly.
Yes.
So that's what I said before, the importance of recognising that energy efficiency renewables is already a powerful synergy, and they should be working together for mutual benefit. And my personal anecdote with my house is a perfect example of that. But the third leg of this is the demand side response.
Yes.
So to be able to integrate those three such that you can reduce the costs of all of the three of those is absolutely crucial. I mean, there is a lot of roof space and a lot of roof space that needs covering with PV, for example, just to choose that example. But the more we can get out of that PV, the better. And the better that we can time it, the better as well.
Great. Professor White, thank you so much for joining us. Please,
Cheers.
everyone, join me in thanking Stuart White. Yes, thank you. Good on you. Cheers. Thanks.